suggestions. I don't want to be too bossy here. So when Penny is speaking or when anyone else is speaking, please mute. So the little microphone down on the bottom of your screen, just click that little mic and that will mute you. And as we mentioned, please save your questions until the end of the presentation or write them in the chat. This is being recorded, and if you don't want your image in the recording, you should click on the little camera and that'll shut off the camera. So if you don't want your face shown in the recording. So Penny will present for about 15 minutes and she has some photos that she would like to share. And then after that, have lots of questions. I can't wait for the questions. Penny has been a kind of a hero for me from the moment I heard about her life. So this is a great moment. So let me just say a little bit about Penny and then turn it over to her. Penny Patch left college in 1962 at the age of 18 and worked for 3 years with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC as we called it, as an organizer in Georgia and Mississippi. She helped with community voter registration. Gotta admit somebody here, okay. She helped with voter registration and election campaigns, organized and participated in demonstrations to desegregate public accommodations, and taught in freedom schools, and got arrested a lot. This experience transformed her life. She's contributed her story to 2 books. I recommend them: Deep in Our Hearts, 9 White Women in the Freedom Movement, and Hands on the Freedom Plow, Personal Accounts by Women in SNCC. So it is our great pleasure and honor to have Penny Patch. And if you would like Penny, just to have her, you can click over, just put your cursor over her face and click on the pin, the little push pin, and that will just show her and you'll go off to the side. So if we're all set, everybody's muted, everybody's done their pinning. Penny, share your story, please.
Well, hello, everybody, and thanks for having me. I did want to notice that we're studying the history that involves racism, voter suppression, law enforcement, education, and violence. And some of these things probably sound pretty familiar in the present. I think the only thing that was absent back then was climate change. So yes, I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes. And I do want to acknowledge that my beloved brother Ike is in this meeting. And I think most of you know him. So as Martha said, when I was very young, between the ages of 18 and 21, I left college. And went south to work for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I'll add that moving to Vermont in the aftermath of my time in SNCC, I became a nurse midwife, and I have a history of work in maternal child health. And also, after some years of paralysis in the aftermath, I became actively engaged again in racial justice work. And largely that work has involved raising consciousness and awareness amongst us white people to help move us to action. So I'm just going to give you a little overview of SNCC for starts. We were a largely always Black-led organization of young people. Founded in 1962 as the sit-in movement spread across the South. We were students from historically Black colleges, also at Northern and Southern, and then also Black students recruited from rural towns in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina, North Carolina, and so on. And then there were those of us who were white. Not a lot of us in those early years. And we also came from the North and South. So SNCC's work expanded from the sit-in movement to include voter registration campaigns across the South. That included organizing something called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, in which we challenged the seating of the white Mississippi delegation at the Democratic Convention in 1964. That is a whole story in itself. We grew freedom schools, community center, health centers, and above all, we became organizers that took our guidance from the people we were organizing. That's what these days is called bottom-up organizing, if you've heard the term. I will say we were young, we were reckless. Some of the time we were thoughtful and strategic. And for a time, our organization crossed all race, class, and regional boundaries. And just last week, SNCC, we had our 60th anniversary conference, online, not in person, which was really too bad. But it still was filled with intergenerational participants and racial justice organizers sharing information and strategies in the present time. So, nothing has stopped. So I wanted to say a little bit about why I joined the movement, which is a process that I've had to figure out my whole life. And there are likely multiple reasons that most of us do things, including being in the right place at the right time. And for me, that was Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania. But here are two central reasons. And I know Ike is listening to this. I grew up with a dad in the Foreign Service, and we moved all over the world. And in 1946, at the age of 2, I was in China. At 5, I was in Czechoslovakia. And at 6, I was in Germany. And then at 13, I came back to the United States, completely confused about where I belonged, certainly not the United States. So I left Swarthmore College for the Freedom Movement 5 years later, and the Freedom Movement actually provided me a place to belong, which is incredibly ironic since I was a white Northern woman and who grew up as part of a pretty privileged class. So another part of the reason I joined is I was raised by parents who had a pretty keen, deep commitment to social justice. And so I acquired during my post-World War II childhood a bone-deep understanding of genocide, political oppression, and of the Holocaust. And in every location I lived in as a child, I was on the ground in the aftermath of World War II. And in China, we were in the midst of a civil war. I think I absorbed something as a very young child in China, where close friends of my family were Jewish refugees from Berlin, Germany. But I really found out about the Holocaust in Germany in 1952, when my parents took me along on a trip to a former concentration camp called Dachau in Munich, Germany. I was 9 years old, and I remember standing in front of a row of whitewashed ovens, and I've since, established that, yes, indeed, that's what I was seeing. And hearing that men, women, and children had been burned up in those ovens because they were Jewish. I don't think I knew if they were alive or dead when they were put in there. I wasn't Jewish, but I think I lost my boundaries and felt danger myself. And I never really got to process this information well with my parents, nor with the parents of my German friends, whom I would ask. I did this 2 or 3 times. I would ask, so what did you do during the war? And how come you didn't stop it from happening? And I got only complete silence. And my friends had never heard anything about the Holocaust in the 1950s. I shut myself down because I knew I wouldn't be welcomed into my friends' homes if I kept asking. But then 5 years later, when the civil rights movement showed itself up in front of my door, I just leaped. And we didn't have the term bystander then, but I knew that I wasn't going to be one. So that's some of the reasons why. I'm just going to tell you a story from the summer of 1962 in Southwest Georgia, where I went to work on an integrated SNCC's very intentionally and experimental effort at having an integrated project on the ground in the Deep South. So in July of 1962, there was a meeting of maybe 25 Black residents of Terrell County, Georgia, and several SNCC organizers. And that was happening in this small rural church. I'm going to show you a picture of this church later, called Mount Olive Baptist Church. The purpose was to talk about voter registration. And at a certain point in the proceedings, the sheriff, Z.T. Matthews of Terrell County, Georgia, walked in the room with 15 or so men with him, all of them armed. And they came in to break up the meeting, intimidate. So Charles Sherrod, who was our project director, he was standing talking, and he began to pray. Other people joined him. Lucius Holloway, the leader of the Terrell County movement, a local leader, spoke. I gave a report from Lee County, which was the neighboring county where I was working. And other SNCC folks, Black and white, stood up and said things. And then when the sheriff asked them to identify themselves and give their names, some people did and some people didn't. And then we stood together and held hands and sang "We Shall Overcome." There's an account of this story that it was in the New York Times a few days later, and that's because there were 3 newspaper men in the building. They had actually come to Albany, Georgia, a small city nearby, to cover the work of Dr. Martin Luther King, who was there at that time in the summer. And Charles Sherrod, my project director, recruited them to come out to our small rural meeting. And when the sheriff came in the building, Sherrod managed to explain to the sheriff that these were 3 newspaper men, and he introduced them. And so what I remember from this event is how afraid I was. And I didn't even know nearly as well as many of the other people at the meeting with me, but that the sheriff and his guys, they could have beaten us to the ground. They could have burned the church down over our heads. They could have shot us. I mean, they could do anything at that point. But because of Claude Sitton and other newspaper people, they didn't. We had flat tires when we came out of the meeting. Some people certainly had repercussions later, but at that time, nothing awful happened. And I will say it's the singing in those circumstances that I remember best. And that's not the only time we did that. And then I remember a flashlight being flashed in my face as I came out the door and climbed into a car. And when we finally got going, we were followed all the way back to Albany by people in trucks with guns. And Mount Olive Baptist Church was burned down to the ground a little while later, as were other churches that we were meeting in. Some of the lessons that I carry from this time, from my work in the movement, in everything I've done since, I carry huge respect for the leadership and profound capability of people with less education and less privilege than I. Yes, Charles Sherrod, Miss Ella Baker, some of you may have heard of her. Bob Moses, you may have heard of him. They were all highly educated Black people and were my leaders and mentors. But so were members of the Gaines family, the Christian family, the Sanders family of Albany, Georgia. And my brother Ike actually met some of these people. Mrs. Mama Dolly Raines, a fierce midwife in Lee County, Georgia, who sheltered and protected us. Lucius Holloway, leader of the Terrell County movement, and Mr. and Mrs. Robert Miles of Batesville, Mississippi, and Mr. and Mrs. Roland Nelson of Sardis, Mississippi. I'm just naming their names because I just want them to be heard. They were as important, more important than any of us. I learned how to cross lines of race and class every which way, and this has affected all the work I have done since. Some of it related to racism, and some of it to the part of my life when I was a public health nurse over here in the Northeast Kingdom, and nurse midwife amongst low-income and working-class white people in Vermont. Mama Dolly, who was the first midwife I ever met. I learned so many skills to type, yes, because sometimes I worked in the office, to speak publicly, and I'm a relatively shy person, to plan and organize and knock on people's doors, and I learned how to continue to work through fear and exhaustion. And I could do it because I was part of a team of SNCC people and local community people too. But SNCC people we were family to each other in those years. And when I talk to young people, one of the things I always sort of make a point of with them is that they are going to be able to do a lot more if they're a part of a team than if they're out there doing something all by themselves. I want to add that, yes, there was sexism, of course. It was 1962, 63, 65. But it's also absolutely true that the women in SNCC worked more equally beside men than in any other activist organization of the time. And that includes all the civil rights organizations, but also the anti-war organizations, SDS, and so on. This was especially true if you were a Black woman, but also much of the time it was true if you were a white woman. We were young. We had an incredible mentor in the presence of a woman named Miss Ella Baker, and everybody was needed at full strength. So it was, of course, never uncomplicated being white in the Black freedom movement. My initial lack of knowledge and steep learning curve contributed to my making mistakes. There were deep relationships born out of huge shared danger versus the reality that building trust with Black comrades was a long and complicated process. We did do it. Or, for example, the two balanced reasons why it was a strategic decision to have white people present on the ground, because white people then got much more attention from the media and the press and helped then to bring in federal intervention, which wasn't going to happen if only Black people were being injured and killed and arrested. But versus the fact that sometimes our presence caused more danger to the Black communities we worked in. And this was like a constant part of a conversation and sometimes argument between us in these long, long staff meetings that we would have. So nothing very efficient about them. They went on all night. The other thing I was taught was the concept of the long haul, that we stand on the shoulders of others, and others are now standing on ours. It is time for the young people to grab the baton, and they are certainly doing it. And I'm unclear exactly all the ways in which it's still my job to be active. That's ever evolving. I'm 77, But one thing I do know is that I want to support the younger generations every way we can figure out to do so. And my guess is that there are people in this room who feel the same way. So I'm going to ask George to run down a series of about 10 photographs. And some of them will relate to what I've just said. And you'll see that. In fact, most of them do. So. Okay, George, you're on. Okay, so picture number one. This was taken in Jackson, Mississippi. I think it was 1964, probably. You will see three young people. Anne Moody is the young Black woman in the back. Joan Trumpauer and John, I'm forgetting his last name. But they are conducting a sit-in at a Woolworths in Jackson, and you can see what's happening. They did, in these circumstances, sometimes you got hot coffee poured on you, sometimes you were beaten bloody, and on the other hand, sometimes it was ketchup that was poured on you. So I think possibly that's what was going on for John at that point in time. But people would be ripped off the seats and just, beaten terribly. And they kept coming back. More and more young people kept coming back. Okay, George, next one. So this is the Student Voice, which is a newspaper that we put together, a newsletter that we sent north and south and everywhere we could get it out to, because it was one of the ways we could contribute, explain what was going on. And what you'll see in that particular picture and headline is "Churches Burned, Night Riders Attack SNCC Staff in Southwest Georgia Voter Registration Drive." And that story that I told you about Mount Olive Baptist Church that we had our meeting in, it was burned to the ground a little while later. And there's SNCC folks and local people. Yeah. Gathering there. Okay, next. And this is just another student voice talking about Hattiesburg, Mississippi. 150 people try to register to vote. You see another little piece that says SNCC backs the boycott. That was in Atlanta. And also in Atlanta, SNCC versus the Ku Klux Klan, who invaded a restaurant that we were sitting in on. You can see the young Black woman who's got her back turned to the Klan people, and she's singing. She's leading song. Okay, next. And this is a SNCC, an official pamphlet from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and you'll see that 3 SNCC staff folks are visiting with a woman on her porch, and then there's a gentleman way in the background. He's obviously opting to not sit on the porch at that moment, but she is talking to us. And we would have long conversations with people and sometimes go back and back and back to talk again before people would then decide they were going to risk lives, jobs, everything they had to go down to the courthouse to register, to try and register to vote. The guy in the foreground, and when I'm looking at him, the young Black man with glasses, that's Bob Moses. And some of you may have heard of him. He died recently, very recently. Okay, next. This is something that we handed out in Mississippi. One man, one vote for freedom. And the flip side of it, George, if you go to the next one, you'll see this is Panola County, where I worked for a year. Citizens of Panola County, you can register. And this was 1965. And by that time, we had gotten a federal injunction that said that you can register to vote in Panola County, Mississippi. It wasn't true all across the country yet. The Voting Rights Act hadn't quite been passed, but it was getting there. That was the flip side of the picture with the 2 children that we would hand out to people every which way and take to their houses and so on. Okay, next. And this is the family. This is Mr. and Mrs. Roland Nelson. And their 6 children. They lived on a plantation called the Hayes Plantation in Sardis, Mississippi. And they took every possible risk to participate in the movement, and they helped to organize all the sharecroppers on their plantation to go down and register to vote. And of course, many of them were then kicked out of their homes. I'm hearing somebody, I'm in the library, in our local library, because our internet was wobbly in the last couple of days. I hear a voice. Is that bothering anybody? No, good, okay. So I want to say a little bit more here. The tallest young girl, that's Ruthie Nelson. And she and her brother, who's standing next to her, and her brother, the other slightly older one, sort of cat-a-corner to her. They were amongst the very first children who integrated the Batesville, Mississippi elementary school. Yes. And if you go on to the next picture, that you'll see, I think maybe this went out in some of the publicity. That's actually me. And that's Mrs. Rosamay Nelson. And I think I'm taking her information particularly related to the process we were undergoing to organize the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which was an independent effort of the regular Mississippi Democratic Party. But there's Mrs. Nelson starting off, her participation. I want to add that about 20 years ago, I got in touch again with the Nelson family because we went to reunions down there, and I had a chance to talk to Mrs. Nelson until 2018 when she died. She and I would call each other maybe once a month and just check in about everything. So I just treasured that relationship. Next. And this is the Panola County Freedom Reader. And this was put out by the local high school students who were part of something called the Mississippi Freedom Student Union. And this was this one rural county in Mississippi's, this is where we were all we had a project there, and I was part of that effort. You can see it says, there's the Panola County Jail. People you can only see it scratchily, but they're walking in. We went to jail once and we will go again. Everybody wants freedom and everybody is going to get it. Okay, so last picture. That's Christine Watson. She was part of the Panola County movement. She was in that high school. She was part of putting out this, newsletter from the high school. She took part in everything on the planet. She was amazing, and she was 14 years old. She survived it. She actually, later in life, became a school teacher. So I'm going to end with you seeing Christine. And lastly, I'm going to read you a very short poem. And this, in the freedom schools, many things happened in the freedom schools, but one of them was that the young people who were participating wrote poetry. And this poem was written by Naomi Long Nadgett from the Greenwood, Mississippi Freedom School. And she said, I didn't know her. This has just been my favorite poem from this time forever. It says she was 12 years old when she wrote this. And people were amazing, young people were. And this poem is called Midway. I've come this far to freedom and I won't turn back. I'm changing to the highway from my old dirt track. I'm coming and I'm going, and I'm stretching and I'm growing, and I'll reap what I've been sowing, or my skin's not black. I've prayed and slaved and waited, and I've sung my song. You've slashed me and you've treed me, and you've everything but freed me. But in time you'll know you need me, and it won't be long. I've seen daylight breaking high above the bow. I've found my destination and I've made my vow. So whether you abhor me or deride me or ignore me, mighty mountains loom before me, and I won't stop now. Naomi Long Nadgett.
Oh my goodness. Thank you, Penny, very much.
So where are we? We are at 2:00. Okay, we've got some time. Yes.
So please, if you have a question for Penny, please either raise your hand physically or pop up that little icon. And while we're waiting for this, I've got a question that I'm going to start out with. Penny, where are we today?
I think, many of you know that as much as I do. my connection to the freedom movement, and I still am connected to people. And I was at this SNCC conference, which was not all about the past. And I work with an organization in central Vermont called Showing Up for Racial Justice, SURJ. There are lots of young people engaged in all of the issues that we're faced with. And then there are many of us of various generations that are doing parts also. I don't have an answer for that. It's possible to be in deep despair about what's facing us, you know? But I also don't think it doesn't serve me very well to feel completely hopeless and, you know, go back to bed and just wait to see what happens and think that I'm going to be immune also because I live in, you know, rural Vermont. Yeah.
Your experiences in Vermont, I'm just looking to see if anybody else has a question, raise your hand or wave it around or something. But so you've been in Vermont for how long, Penny?
Since 1970. So that's 51 years.
Over those 51 years, what have you observed in Vermont as far as racism or an improvement? What's happening in our own Green Mountain State?
Well, there's a lot happening now, and multiple organizations doing work on, you know, all sorts of issues that are confronting people of color in Vermont. And that, you know, everything from housing and law enforcement and immigration issues and education. I mean, the critical race theory, anti-critical race theory folks are really out there. So there's a lot going on now. 50 years ago, very, very little related to racial justice. And it was, I mean, personally for me, that was very hard when I landed here. I had left the movement and I moved into, it was a difficult time for me, I will say that. And I then ended up moving to Vermont, literally because my boyfriend of the time had grown up in Shaftesbury, Vermont, and we had worked together in Mississippi. Anyway, we came to Vermont, and here I was. My ability to find people who would recognize that race was an issue pretty much didn't succeed. I will say that I pretty early on made connections with people in what's now called the LGBTQ community. And lesbian women in particular, who became my friends, were the only white people that I knew. I think there were others around, but I didn't find them. But lesbian women in the 1970s did understand about oppression. And so they had some sense of awareness and connection to the issue. But it's really different now, although I think there's a lot of us who still think it's not major. But I think so much is connected to it, to racism. It's really amazing. And the fact is, we also need everybody in every coalition that we can possibly make, is my view at this point, to tackle climate change and education and housing. And I mean, in Vermont, we at least everybody gets to vote. I will hand that to us.
Come on, Guy. Jane, you have a question? You want to unmute?
Okay, go for it.
This is Jane.
My name is Jane Van Landingham. My partner Betsy is with me in this frame. We have been together for 22 years and married for 17 and a half of those years. I want to thank you for your service. I was just slightly, well, I was behind you in some ways, ahead of you in others, but you obviously got further than I did, sooner than I did. That is to say, I grew up in a small, extremely segregated community in North Carolina.
Ah,
My father was the town lawyer, or one of them. He was also the school board attorney.
wow.
He was a person who had goodwill towards all people, but he also had to help write the plan about how they were going to integrate the school system in my little town, and most people didn't want to do that. And the feds turned down their first plan. I don't know who put what into it.
Mhm.
My father when my father died, my grandmother's cook, Annie Mae, who had worked for her for 30 years, came to me and said, you know, your daddy was the only white person in this town that if I went up street for your grandmother to the bank, if he was talking to Mr. Hundley, the bank president, he would stop talking to Mr. Hundley and say, greet me by name.
Mhm.
And she said there was not another white person in this town that would do that.
Mhm.
Annie Mae's daughter and I are good friends, and we've decided that we're cousins now. Because my grandmother, whose name was Mamie Lyles, well, she was an amazing person. Also had goodwill towards many people, but she did have a hard time when Black people were on television. But she was a big Arthur Godfrey fan and so forth. But she waited for that. And I had a very moving experience when I was an adult, when I went down to her house at lunchtime and discovered that she and Annie Mae were, of course, as they always did, having lunch together. They would never have done it as together as we would call it. But Nana was sitting on one side of the door from the kitchen to the breakfast room, and Annie Mae was sitting at the counter on the other side of the door. And I looked at them and I thought, these women are each other's best friends, because all their other friends had died. And it's so moving to me to see that. And Annie Willie always said, you know, Ms. Lyles, my grandmother, and Annie Mae were just like sisters. And after she said that about 3 times, I said, you know, I think that makes us cousins, doesn't it? So now we call each other cousins. And in itself, cousin is an important relationship. It's not just some small thing.
Yes. Yes.
I was saved by going to an Episcopal girls' school, which of course was segregated, and it was in Virginia. And I wanted to go from there to Mount Holyoke, and my mother said I had too many northern ideas already, and so she wouldn't pay for any schools north of Washington.
Mm-hmm.
And she didn't. And I didn't have enough independence at 16 to say, well, then I'll write to Mount Holyoke, I bet they'll give me a scholarship, because they probably would. This was 1961, 62.
Yeah.
But then I went, the hardest place to get into in the South was Duke. And particularly if you were from North Carolina, you couldn't, if you came from Cleveland or California, you could get into Duke. But if you were from North Carolina,
well, this is actually
Jane, do you have a question for Penny? Do you have a question?
I think it's
yes. I do have a question. It's a long way to get to it, but I wanted to kind of put me in the context here. That one of the things that has been an ongoing problem for me and I wonder how you dealt with it, is that I grew up, as I said, in a totally segregated culture and so forth. And then I married a Yankee from Massachusetts, and we went off to Ann Arbor during the early 60s, where everybody was going to jail right and left and so forth. And but while I lasted for 3 semesters at Duke, and Duke was still segregated until my sophomore year. And then we tried to, and I have since met a woman here in Betsy's Church who was picketing at one of the same places in Durham, North Carolina that I was picketing with young people. And I said to her, you know, if the Durham police had gotten it together, we could have been cellmates, except that back then they didn't put black people and white people in the same cells.
Yeah. So Jane,
what that has created is that here I am at 77.
Me too, yeah.
For the first time meeting educated black people, because I married this Yankee and we moved to Portland, Maine. Well, good luck there as well. And I wonder how you have dealt with all that living in Vermont.
Well, it's been a bit of a, it's in the early years, it was a struggle. I lost my connections to my SNCC comrades, but I have regained a fair number of them. My Black SNCC comrades, for the most part, do not live in Vermont. But I see them, I talk to them. They are grounding people for me. In Vermont, working in the racial justice movement in Vermont, I do meet Black people for sure, who are engaged in that same work. My mission is mostly working in the white community, of which we have tons in Vermont. But that's where I've found my connections in Vermont. And I wanted to just, Jane, I wanted to express my appreciation, for your story. And I don't have, any perfect answer to your question, but I want to acknowledge that there were always people like your father. I mean, not enough, but they existed in the South. They stuck their necks out. They took risks. There are some that are very well known, like Ann Braden, Will Campbell, and then we all, in the young people in SNCC, we had a whole contingent of young white Southerners who joined, and many of them lost their families in the process. So I want to acknowledge where you came from, how to solve, how to make connection with, people of color. One thing that does work is if you do work, racial justice work in one way or another, so that you're on the ground and you're doing the work. So, any other questions?
I have one more, not to be, unless somebody wants to jump in here. So in 1965, Penny, what did you do? You left. I want not to get too personal here, but I want to know how your life.
Well, I've contributed to 2 books in particular. One of them was very personal. So it's a history book. It's all over the place. And I don't mind being personal. And I will say that in 1965, 1966, what was happening with SNCC is that white people were being pushed out, and SNCC was becoming a completely Black organization, which at the time was hugely painful for me. In retrospect, I sort of feel like it was inevitable. It served a certain purpose. I understand it. I've talked to some of my friends about this, the whole subject. But at the time it was excruciating, and I was kicked out into a white world. And other than the family that Ike is part of, I really couldn't relate at all. And so I had some years went to California for a couple of years, then came to Vermont, was part of a commune on a mountaintop in East Haven. I didn't know what I was doing. I did have a child. That took up a certain amount of attention. And then eventually I found my way into healthcare and midwifery. And it took some years to do that process. Those were not years that I was very happy. I will say that. And I also think, in retrospect, many of us who went through the whole deal, with all the violence and the threats and the Black and white, we came out of it with what's now defined as PTSD. So, I feel like I've left a lot of that behind, but it took work. And then a few years, somewhere in there, and it took until the 1980s, really, when civil rights began to be taught in schools, and people in Vermont sort of got the idea that I knew something about this and had been through, been part of it, and I got asked to speak. And then we had a big reunion at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, of SNCC people, and a conference. And that's where a lot of us found each other again. That was 1988, so we're talking 20 years, Yeah.
Anybody else have a question, comment? Okay, I'm going to ask another one. I could spend the whole rest of the day just down here. I want to know. Actually, this is with Ike. I want to get Ike involved in it. Where was your family, Penny, in all of this while you were in the South? And so I understand that your family was supportive, and I hear your life and all across the world. But Ike, what were you doing? What were you thinking about what Penny? And you're younger than Penny, right?
Mm-hmm. He's 5 years.
Yeah. My parents they were worried about Penny in the South, of course, because he was in a dangerous situation, but they were behind her 100% what she was doing. We got some mail, that threatened us and that kind of thing. But I was in Englewood, New Jersey, and my school was half Black, and there was a whole period in my life I thought I was Black, and my parents in the summer of '62, I believe, drove me and my brother down to Albany, Georgia. We stayed in Black families' houses and marched in the streets, and were followed by the police, and we're so honored to be in the churches and hear the singing and the unity of the people there. It was very moving, and that whole period in my life, I was just so affected by what Penny was doing, and so proud of her, and the subsequent year, I think I went down to Ecuador, but my brother went with my parents to Jackson, Mississippi, and participated there. So, and it was And my parents were involved in desegregating the schools in Englewood, New Jersey at the time too, and part of the Democratic takeover of the town, which was a staunchly Republican town. So it was a very, very lively, exciting time. And thank you, Penny, so much. I learned a lot just hearing this. And you're very informative, and you moved me very much. Thank you.
Aw, thanks, Ike. That's not simple having an older sister with this kind of history.
Not easy to do.
Their history is also quite to be noted.
We'll get Ike to do a presentation. Betsy, you have a question. Betsy Emerson.
Well, I just a comment. It feels like things have come full circle, and the people who felt flipped in the South or other parts of this country are standing up for what they feel is their right to the expense of everybody else. And it just is a very discouraging time. I don't know, if you have comments about that or ways we can make it better, which is probably impossible at this point.
Well, yeah, I don't have well, the only thing that and this is from my experience, that what I know is that clearly there are Black people organizing for the vote, for equal rights, for any number of things, all across the country. But in the South, and to a degree in the North, there are organizations of white people who are trying to do that work too in the white community. And in the South, I particularly know in Georgia, in Alabama, in Louisiana, there are white people who are reaching into those communities that feel so deprived and therefore are so afraid and therefore are so susceptible to, all the disinformation and everything else. So there's organizing work going on to reach people like that. A little piece of it that I took part in was in the last election. They were an organization, it was Surge showing up for racial justice, but in Georgia, they were running a phone banking campaign in cooperation with Black organizations too. But our job was we were to be making phone calls into the white community. They had identified people who maybe had at some point voted Democratic, hadn't voted in a long time, who knew how they voted. And our job, what we were attempting, was to reach out to them and get them to vote on our side of things. And there was some evidence that it made a difference, that there were white people in Georgia who voted for Senator Warnock and Senator Ossoff. But it's like this takes a whole lot of on the ground, day by day work. And there are people doing it. I'm not doing it at that level anymore, but thank heavens that there are younger generations who are. So.
I just want to quickly say that I'm really glad that you and your younger brother did better than mine. My brother is 2.5 years younger than me, and he spent most of his adult life as a Confederate soldier reenactor, going to play with Confederates. And I have across from me here a photograph of my great-grandfather Macaja Van Landingham in his Confederate uniform. He
Yeah.
looks like he's not old enough to vote, and he's holding somebody's horse pistol across his chest that he obviously couldn't afford. But it's great if you have some friends at home as well as.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, it helped.
Okay, anyone else have a question or a comment at this point? Thank you, Penny, for so many, many reasons. Thank you for your time.
I'm delighted to meet you all. I mean, the ones that I got a glimpse of, and thanks for coming. And Martha also knows how to reach me, as does Ike. If you have any other thoughts, questions, anything, Okay.
Thank you all for coming. Take care, everybody. Do good work.
Thank you.
So Martha,
Thank you, Penny.
thank you all. Yeah.